want to thank you all for being here and emphasize that this is not a panel discussion. This is an audience discussion. So we're expecting audience participation. We're going to talk for a little while, say some provocative things, but then we're going to have a full-fledged discussion with all of you about what the elections mean for the internet in the coming years. David didn't mention that Livestream has also been one of our sponsors for this event. They're helping us webcast this to a very large audience. And because we are webcasting, it would ask you to identify yourself when you ask questions in the audience participation part of the session. For the last several months, we've been watching the election, hearing a lot of issues brought up. And every so often, innovation, the digital economy, the internet, and the potential of these technologies gets mentioned. If you read the party platform, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you'll see that there's more mention of digital issues than ever before. Some of it's rather vague, some of it's not very controversial. Things like internet is good, free internet, open internet is better, innovation good. But there's actually some real significant language in these party platforms and some differences. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to explore what the candidates are saying, what the two parties are saying about the future of the internet, and explore what could happen after November 6th and how that election might change the direction of internet development in this country and around the world. We're also going to think not just about the presidential election, but we're going to look a little bit at Capitol Hill and think about what could happen if the Republicans take control of the Senate, or if the Democrats take control of the House. What are the issues they're going to be dealing with, and how could things be different after this election? We are not going to have a debate today. We do have two Democrats up here on the left, and two Republicans on the right. But this isn't a debate, and we're not representing the campaigns. We did ask for surrogate speakers from the campaigns, and each of them had the same answer. Who's the other guy sending it? So we decided to go with the best of the best and get three people who have been right in the midst of the telecom and internet policy making process in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration. And they're not going to be speaking on behalf of the campaign, but they're going to be talking about what the campaigns believe, what the parties believe, and what they think are going to be the hot issues going forward. We're going to have some opening statements, and we'll have a little bit of discussion among the panelists, and then we'll turn to you. Our first speaker is the Honorable Philip J. Bond. He is now the President and CEO of Atrizo Bond, which is a small, very high-powered lobbying organization here in Washington. Prior to that, Phil spent more than 5 years as the head of Tech America, which is the largest information technology trade association. He led it through a very important phase of expansion. They are the place to go on everything from cloud policy to online privacy issues to the future of big data. So it's a very important group, and Phil earned a lot of respect from both parties in his role there. Prior to that, he was the Undersecretary for Technology in the Bush administration, Commerce Department, and again, was right in the midst of a lot of very important policy decisions. So I'll turn it over to Phil to talk a little bit about what he sees as the most important issues on the table and what Mr. Romney would be likely to focus on if he were elected.
Thanks. It's great to be with all of you. Sounds like here, okay in the back? Yeah.
We don't have the microphone on. I think the microphone's not on.
That would kind of be a issue. I think that would be better.
Okay.
A little better?
Yes.
Ooh.
Okay.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you to isoc and Mike Nelson in particular for reaching out and doing this. I know a little bit about what the gentlemen here on the panel with me are going to say, and so I'm going to play off a little bit of that in advance. But I want to pick up on something that Mike said at the very outset, that we hear a lot about at a very high level. Innovation good, internet good, open internet better, I think was the way Mike put it. And I for one, have have been frustrated that we haven't heard more detail across the board on what that means. What is an innovation ecosystem? There are all kinds of policy pieces of that, from R&D to all kinds of tech transfer, whether it's out of federal labs or private labs, to becoming a company and what does a small company need, to scaling and financing a larger enterprise, to create jobs. What does it mean in a global model to drive innovation? We haven't heard a lot of that. And I think John may pick up on this a little bit more, but I think we kind of hear that the internet is a social and economic force, and the other party says it's an economic and social force. Not a whole lot of difference, maybe some distinction between the two. So maybe just to tee up some of the later conversation, my basic postulate is this, that because the election is most likely to yield narrower margins in the House and the Senate, conventional wisdom, certainly on this particular day, in this particular setting inside the Beltway, would be that the president was reelected, although I have to observe for everybody that October 24th to 26th, 1980, Gallup tracking poll had Jimmy Carter up by 5 with a week to go. So far from that. So I think really it becomes not so much a conversation about the details and technicalities of the internet and innovation, but more about the fundamentals. Tax, trade, and talent. And I will submit, and we'll come back to, that with the House staying where it is and the Senate being narrower either way, that the White House and House relationship is going to be really important to getting anything done. And while I'm sure not everyone would agree, I think the potential for positive outcomes on territorial tax, on internet tax for retailers, which I happen to believe is an important issue for others in the ecosystem to think about, for trade, a more aggressive trade agenda, for business visas. Those things, a Romney administration would be better for the fundamentals. And I'm not sure we can get much past on some of the technicals. So I'll leave it there and come back to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Bill. And now for a word from the Democrats. Eddie Lazarus just recently left the Federal Communications Commission, where he was the chief of staff. I worked at the FCC about 15 years ago, and I have to tell you, chief of staff is the hardest job there, because you have to keep everybody happy, both parties, and you have to keep all the employees happy. But Eddie has got a very impressive resume. He was law clerk for Justice Harry Blackmun back in the late 80s. He was, as I say, he was at the FCC for 2.5 years. Before that, he was at Aiken Gun. And the most significant thing, or the most interesting thing for me in his Wikipedia entry, was that we were born 3 days after I was. So we both had happy birthdays a week and a half ago. So over to you, Eddie.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this forum. I think it's, as Phil said, these issues are under-discussed in the campaign. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about them because they are increasingly important to every aspect of American life. I will say that if the test of how I did my job was keeping everyone happy, I think I failed miserably. But mercifully, I didn't think about that as being the test. One thing that I think Phil and I would probably agree on is that telecommunications policy, tech policy, is an area in which there's actually more bipartisanship than there is in many other areas. In fact, while I was there, about 95% of the things that the FCC did were done on a bipartisan basis, which is not something you can say about every institution in Washington. I think it's an important differential. But there are some things that may well have gone very differently had a Republican been in charge over the last few years rather than a Democrat. So I thought I might just start out by hitting a few of those, and that might generate some discussion. So one area of enormous importance as the United States builds out what I like to call its knowledge platform, broadband internet, is the rollout of LTE, the next generation wireless technology. This is an area in which the United States is actually leapfrogging the rest of the world. We were behind in 3G when we came into office. We're now ahead in 4G, and we have a real opportunity to lead the world in 4G wireless for the foreseeable future. And one of the aspects, one thing that's going to be necessary to preserve and expand the United States' lead in this very, very important space is more spectrum coming to the market. Now, I think Republicans and Democrats agree on the need for more spectrum, but one thing that we did, and obviously should be measured by our accomplishments, is we came up with an entirely new way of repurposing spectrum from one set of current licensees to mobile broadband uses. It's called the incentive auctions, which is a new kind of two-sided auction. I won't get into the details here, but it was a policy innovation that the Obama administration came up with and put its political muscle behind to get passed through Congress, authorizing legislation so that a good chunk of broadcast spectrum will ultimately be repurposed to mobile broadband. That's going to be great for 4G rollout, and that's going to be, in turn, great for the economy. You know, the iPhone 5, which is the first LTE connected device, of course, just is launching. It's expected to add 0.5% to GDP. So spectrum policy is crucially important to that. And I'm not saying that a Republican administration would have been against repurposing spectrum, only that the Obama administration did come up with a terrific innovation and got it through Congress despite some Hill recalcitrance on Republicans. Second, competition policy. I think it's probably true, although there's no way of knowing, that had a Republican been in charge over the last few years, there would now only be 3 mobile broadband competitors rather than 2, because the AT&T-T-Mobile merger, which this administration halted, probably, no way of knowing for sure, probably would have gone through. And I would argue that that would have raised consumer prices and also reduced competition in a very important space where competition is the driver of investment and innovation. The proof of that is in how much money is now going into the build-out of these 4G networks. And finally, I'll just touch on, because it's the elephant in the room, I'll touch on open internet. This is an area where the Republican FCC chair had adopted open internet policies as principles, but not as rules, and where the Obama administration, the current FCC, took the next step and adopted a very high-level set of open internet rules that basically say people should be able to go where they want, not be blocked from going to lawful websites or applications and services, and where you shouldn't be able to charge a gating fee. The few companies that are ISPs shouldn't charge a gating fee to innovators who want to build the next Facebook, the next Google, the next Twitter. I think it's a bit of a tempest in a teapot, because the truth is, no company has come forward. Two great things. One, no company has come forward with a fact-based, credible case that their revenues have been substantially hurt by these rules. And second, no company has come forward and said, my innovation has been squelched because I can't get onto the internet, which is the lifeblood of any business today. So those are 3 areas in which I think there is some difference, but they shouldn't be allowed to dwarf the fact that there is a common commitment to getting great broadband to all Americans and doing it in a way where you drive investment in innovation and you protect consumers.
Thank you very much, Eddie. So the difference here is that the Republicans and Michael Powell called it open internet, and
they called it net neutrality.
The Democrats called it net neutrality.
We never called it net neutrality because I don't know what that phrase really means. We called it open internet because what we were intending to do was actually preserve the status quo. The internet has flourished as an open platform. We wanted to have some high-level rules to make sure it stayed that way. And we built a big industry consensus around that. There's a lawsuit, of course, going on over this. It's only 2 company plaintiffs, and there's a reason for that, because we adopted reasonable rules, and we worked very closely with all the members of the ecosystem to talk about what reasonable rules were, and we think we put down the football in good path.
But this is one of the issues where the platforms are distinctly different.
Very different from the platforms, yes.
Okay. And to respond, our last speaker is John Newer. He is the president and founder of JKC Consulting, and is also a senior partner at Fairfax Media Partners. Prior to that, he was the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information. ran NTIA, where he was the point person of the Department of Commerce and also the advisor to the President on all of these issues that we have on the table. So, and in addition to doing the domestic stuff, you were on an airplane about a third of the time going to meetings from Geneva to Tokyo.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you to the Internet Society. Is this working?
I have to be very close.
There you go.
I have to do my best lounge singer impersonation. We've all talked a fair bit about the commonality in the party platforms. I actually brought some quotes from the Internet freedom sections. I don't think I will read them. We're getting wound up in this, but you can go and look at them. And I didn't even mark down here whose is whose, and I'm not sure I could identify even though I printed them out this afternoon. But I think one of the reasons that you've got a lot of reason it doesn't get spoken about a lot during the campaign is because there is a certain degree at the top level commonality of interest, and campaigns are about drawing stark distinctions between the parties, not necessarily singing the areas where we have the broad agreement. But in particular, the agreement is around fighting against any changes to the internet governance regime that would include international, intergovernmental sort of a new regulatory environment. I noticed that the Wicked discussion is going to be on Halloween. I don't know if that was a coincidence or it's just something scary that you wanted to celebrate in that way.
Right?
Yeah, Wicked.
The potential of the United Nations or some other intergovernmental organization taking control over what have historically been very base technical internet government policy issues is in fact something that should frighten all of us. But even though at the top level and the rhetoric is all the same, open internet good, international regulation bad, we all agree on these things. I think the real difference between the two is how much they really take that to heart in the way they approach domestic regulation. I think net neutrality is a prime example. I always get very, very suspicious when a regulator or a government agency says, we're going to preserve the status quo by writing new rules. I think by definition, you're changing the status quo. And I think it is, however well-intentioned, has the potential to become a real barrier to innovation and investment when what have historically been arm's length transactions between market participants based upon consumer demand or business plans now need to be tested by some sort of Washington standard of reasonableness. It can have no other effect but add some new level of uncertainty into those sorts of transactions. I think the same goes for cybersecurity. There is a debate, particularly in the Senate and between the administration, on best approaches to cybersecurity, whether the government should be more involved in standard setting, or should the private sector be allowed to follow their own incentives to defend themselves in the ways that they see fit. It's not quite that simplistic, but that's the basic breakdown between the two. In particular, when we are talking about preventing international regulation, it's very difficult from an international perspective for people to hear it all has to be private sector, it all has to be consensus built, it's a multi-stakeholder approach. Except for the United States government, we're going to draft regulations out of the Department of Homeland Security. And I think that has a real problem, in particular because despite a lot of the rhetoric you hear about the United States falling behind in broadband or 16th in the internet or something else equally absurd, the United States is and remains the sort of global epicenter, center of gravity of all things internet. And if you regulate the internet in the United States, you're absolutely going to have an extension of that across the globe, and that makes the people who are in favor of a more internationalized approach to government very much emboldened. So I think those are a couple of the primary distinctions. And I was not going to talk about spectrum, but since you invited the topic, I would point out a couple of observations on the difference between the last administration and the current administration. We lead in 4G. In LTE, every LTE deployment in America is on spectrum that's made available during the Bush administration. We passed multiple statutes. We put out 90 megahertz of AWS spectrum. We did 90 megahertz in the relocation of the analog broadcast systems. We did an additional 254 megahertz in unlicensed Wi-Fi, multiple gigahertz, 70, 80, 90 megahertz. So I completely agree that the measurement is sort of how you produce, and I'll take that measurement on our spectrum performance.
But you get 2 or 3 extra years to see the fruits of your labor.
That's true. That's
Okay.
true. I'll take half of it was in the first.
Okay. So Eddie, reply?
Well, I think the easy way to reply to that is to say auctions is a phony way of measuring whether you've accomplished something on spectrum, because auctions are really based on what was left in the cupboard by your predecessor. You could easily argue that all of that originated under the Reed-Hunt era. I'm not going to make that argument. I don't think that's the right way to measure things. The right way to think about things is, have you innovated? Have you put additional spectrum out there? Have you, for example, this president for the first time set a national target for freeing up additional spectrum for broadband, 500 megahertz, never been done before. First time there was ever a national broadband plan was done under the Obama administration. The largest release of white spaces was done under the Obama administration. There's lots of good that goes on in spectrum policy. I'm not trying to pretend that good things didn't happen under previous administrations, but to just look at that one item is, I think, quite distortive.
There is a subtle difference, though. I mean, the Democrats in the platform talk more about unlicensed spectrum. There's more about sharing spectrum, whereas the Republicans tend to say, okay, we're going to auction this off to one vendor and one owner, and they're going to have it.
Right. So there's an irony, actually, because you did release a lot of unlicensed spectrum, which was a good thing. That spectrum is the spectrum that's used for Wi-Fi, for example, which is absolutely essential to the operating of all of our wireless networks, and that's something that the Democrats have now championed, and at least in the last round was resisted somewhat by the Republicans. But I think overall you're going to see, I think there will have to be consensus around both unlicensed and licensed spectrum getting out there, because I don't think we can succeed as a country in mobile without both. It's going to be every tool in the toolbox approach.
No, this is a question for Eddie. Do you have a quick response to John's charge that the U.S. is not providing a good model for the rest of the world, that we're saying don't regulate the internet, and then we're doing it?
Of course, with all respect, don't fully agree with that, but nobody's been a greater champion of internet freedom than this administration. Hillary Clinton has become the single beacon of open internet freedom. The open internet rules that we adopted, if you cannot distinguish between a rule that says there shall be no central authority, public or private, that picks winners and losers on the internet, versus internet censorship in other countries such as China or others, then we might as well throw common sense and rationality out the window. I'm not an expert on cyber the way John is. I do think, as I understand the executive order that's being contemplated, that would be a voluntary compliance scheme. But I think all administrations are going to have to wrestle with very, very difficult problems of the fact that broadband has become critical infrastructure in this country. It is a vulnerability that needs to be accounted for. There's, of course, an important role for private industry to play in that, but it's always ultimately a government responsibility to make sure that our critical infrastructure is safeguarded, whether it's against terrorist attack or attack of other nations. We have to pay attention to that, and I know there are people who are going to work in good faith on both parties to achieve what is really becoming an ever more important goal.
So a question for Phil to follow up on this. One of the criticisms of the Obama administration has been that they have some people out there like Hillary Clinton talking about the free and open internet, and they have other people talking about the need for innovation and flexibility, and then over at DHS or at Justice Department, they're taking action that looks a lot like the kind of action that you see in semi-dictatorial countries. The problem is maybe that there's not enough coordination in the Obama administration. There isn't a clear direction on what's the line that you can go up to. Do you think the Romney administration would do that better? I'm skeptical, because I don't see him talking a lot about this. I don't see him him deputizing somebody at a high level and saying, bang heads, let's get all together on our digital policy. At least McCain would stand up and say, well, I'm going to let my vice president work on less important stuff like technology. But at least he said it, you know? He said somebody was going to work on it.
Touche. Well, a couple points. I think, first of all, on cybersecurity as an issue, I think that what the definition of critical infrastructure is was one of the real hang-ups. And I think, again, just when you look at the politics, the Romney Administration would be able to accomplish a somewhat lighter version of the macro omnibus cyber bill that was contemplated. And while that might not satisfy some people, it would finally be legislation. I think there would be better odds under a Romney administration. To your point about coordination of Fortune 1, I mean, the government is the biggest enterprise, and any of us who've worked in it know how hard it is to coordinate across these various agencies. Some of the tension is natural and designed and appropriate, and then it is a hurdle that you still have to overcome at the end of the day. So, do I think they would be better at it? I think it's very hard to contemplate how vast the government is until you get in and do that. But I do think that this is a point that that the Romney campaign has not been able to get much traction on, is that the experience that Governor Romney has had in his life should make him a world-class, it has proved him a world-class manager. And that's got to count for something when you take on Fortune 1.
Okay, I'm going to turn now to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and ask John what his speculation is about what could happen if the power shifts on Capitol Hill. In particular, if we got to...
Can I throw a question on yours?
Sure.
I want to throw a wrinkle on it. Go ahead.
Okay, so let's suppose we get both houses controlled by Republicans or both houses controlled by Democrats. Do you think there's any chance we could see a rewrite of the Telecom Act? That's in the Republican platform. They say that the 1996 Telecom Act is hopelessly outdated and talk about it being more like railroads than the internet.
So my second-degree amendment would be, do you agree that if Romney wins, the Senate goes Republican?
Ooh.
And I wouldn't profess to opine on those kinds of things. That sort of campaign politics is not at all I'm anything more than a spectator. You read the sports page, I read the political columns without the same level of insight.
Well, Google has a new Ouija board app on the Android phone that you can try out on the way back.
It would be about as successful a predictor as I would be. I do agree very much with what Eddie was saying at the outset about technology, telecom policy has historically not really been partisan. It has been sectoral in nature. So, some of the biggest pieces of legislation that were very, very heavily fought had a Democrat and Republican co-sponsor on one side of it fighting a different group of Democrats and Republicans on the other side. We take, for example, the Tozan-Dingle legislation about unlimited networks, those sorts of things. That you had a Democrat and Republican representing, one sector of market participants and equally bipartisan opposition on the other side. I do agree that the statute is getting more cumbersome, and or changes in technology have made this statute more cumbersome. The statute, at its core, through its various iterations of amendment, started out as a means to regulate great regulated monopolies, and then it moved on as a way to incentivize the move from monopoly to competition. I would argue that we've got a very, very competitive landscape across the ICT sector. And it's very, very difficult to look at any of those segments as vertical stovepipes that require economic regulation. And it would just simply be more efficient for all the market participants. And in this world of increasing pressure on the government budget, I imagine that we could, what regulation we still require in the telecommunications space would probably be done by fewer people with more streamlined statute.
It doesn't sound like a jobs program to me. Particularly for telecom lobbyists and telecom lawyers.
The but it's a jobs program for innovators and software engineers and RF engineers and the kinds of people who make a real difference that the regulator's there to support and serve. But for there to be that kind of a total rewrite, typically there needs to be some sort of impetus to drive that. So whether it is the outcome of the court case on net neutrality, if that gets overturned and people want to take another look at it, whether it is reform of some of our big subsidies programs, universal service, and some of those others, whether there is a desire from the Congress to take a fresh look at some of those things. Typically, you get that big sort of omnibus legislation when enough people have enough interest to horse trade, a full package. But those things are time consuming. We were joking about this on the, we spoke earlier, that the 96 Telecom Act really came from the breakup of AT&T in 1984, I think that was. There was followed by 10, 12 years of litigation, which gets us fully to the point where it's probably time for another one.
Eddie, do you have an opinion on this? Any chance we're going to see a new telecom bill in the next 4 years?
I agree with a lot of John's analysis. I think it takes a huge push with a very broad coalition, sometimes of strange bedfellows, but definitely a broad coalition before something of that magnitude takes place. And I don't see that in the cards in the immediate future. I do think that as broadband becomes an ever more important part of the American economy, it's already a huge driver of American economy. There's $169 billion in commerce that was done last year on the internet. There will be policy issues that come up, and it is important to have a federal agency that has some basic tools to deal with those problems. Not a heavy-handed set of regulations, but there is, you have to have somebody to manage the spectrum. It's crucially important. You have to have, even in a converged time, consumer protection is very, very important. Looking at market structure questions, John and I probably differ a little bit about the state of competition in the wireline and wireless space. But that fluctuates over time. It's gone from monopoly to incredibly competitive. I would say the pendulum swung back perhaps a little further than is optimal. But that's a dynamic factor. That's not something that's static. So you want to have an FCC with those tools. I think if, just to go back to your scenarios, if the Democrats retain the Senate, assume they're going to win the House, but and the presidency, I don't think you'll see a telecom rewrite. I think that if there's a clean sweep on the Republican side, I doubt you'll see a comprehensive rewrite. I think the one question would be, will there be some giant omnibus reconciliation bill that I don't know all the rules on the Hill, but that avoids the filibuster and can be jammed through, that would be dramatically deregulatory. I think there's some chance of that, and I think that's at the margins, that's something people ought to be thinking about in this election, because that is a difference depending on how it all comes out.
Your comments perfectly captured the different parties' philosophies, by the way, very nicely, 3 minutes each.
I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are on, you made a point earlier on that John quickly agreed with, I would agree with, that this has been relatively nonpartisan in terms of policy space. And certainly there's some people I admire deeply in this administration in key policy posts. Alec Ross over at State is a rock star. Tom Khalil at the White House, and could go on and on. So I think we agree on that. I was leaving that for John. He specifically wanted to be the one to throw a bouquet. But my question is, as it becomes more central, more important to the economy and to the culture, does that increase or decrease the odds that it gets partisan?
I don't know if it's even a question of partisan. I think one of the points that John made, which I agree with, is that it's sectoral. So what Google thinks is good policy, I mean, it's not government versus business. A lot of this is different businesses have different interests here, and the businesses on the edge and the businesses that provide the pipes and notwithstanding the fact that there's some crossover, and I fully agree that there is, see these issues very, very differently. And so I think given that there are very strong forces that will not be able to coalesce around a single vision, at the moment, the more important it is in a way, the more difficult it becomes to have a comprehensive rewrite. We were just, Harna here at Google and I were out at Aspen, and the topic of the conference was, it wasn't quite put this way, but I think it's fair to say the topic was, what would a telecom rewrite look like? And it was a very diverse group of companies and public interest organizations, government folks, and the truth is, after 3 days, I think we were all scratching our heads, lots of good ideas and lots of good thoughts, but not even the remotest concept of exactly what that might even look like. And when you're that far away, it seems like that's a long way.
Several of us volunteered to go to Aspen and tell them what the right answer is. Next time.
I'll let him know.
John, do you have a comment or?
I just want to make one observation about that it is sectoral, but when the government is more heavily involved in a regulatory space rather than an enforcement posture, it creates an incentive for people to seek benefits to their sector through government regulation. Having the government reach in and say, oh, well, this administration favors this sector more than the other. I don't think anybody disputes that we need consumer protection, and we need when a market participant attains market power and abuses that market power in an anti-competitive way. We've got an antitrust division of the Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission that have got a couple of centuries of jurisprudence that they can recognize those sorts of harms, and there are remedies for them. I think the real bright line distinction is, I think Republicans would be more comfortable relying on that enforcement mechanism, and the Democratic administration and Congress look more towards crafting proactive regulations to define preemptively what kinds of things they deem may or may not be consumer harms, without having the opportunity to test those sorts of things in the marketplace. In terms of competition between different platforms, are they one-to-one competitors? Even back when I was in government and we weren't getting 10, 15, 20 megabits per second in LTE speeds on wireless platforms, I wouldn't have argued that wireless was a one-to-one substitute for a wired broadband platform. But it was enough of a substitute to create real barriers to the sort of anti-consumer, anti-competitive behavior you'd be afraid of. If my Comcast or my RCN wireline provider had sent me a notice in the mail and said, from here on out, you can only enter the internet through our proprietary portal, and you can only get our news, I'd cut the cord tomorrow, I'd walk into any of 4 wireless carriers and get a wireless plug for my laptop, and I would be upset about it, but they would feel that pain immediately. So relying on consumers to express their preferences, allowing companies to test various business plans and models and pricing platforms, and allow the Department of Justice and law enforcement to step in when there's a demonstrable misexercise or misallocation of market power, I think is the platform that I think we see much more supported by the Republican side of the equation, and I think it's one that optimizes, innovation and messiness, which is what marks all of this is.
Okay, so we're going to move to the audience in just a minute. I've got one last question.
Can I just jump in
sure.
1 second?
Okay.
I think what you've highlighted is a difference in the view of competition. Because I don't think if you're interested in rich video, that wireless would do the trick. And that leaves a lot of Americans with only 1 or 2 choices. As applications get more data rich, maybe that LTE ultimately can deliver those speeds and consistently in enough places, but that's not today. Back then we thought broadband was going to be delivered over power lines. That didn't emerge, and there's a case to be made to have an agency that doesn't have to only act ex post the way an enforcement agency does, because by the time those cases work their way through things, the very fundamental structure of networks can change. I do think you've identified, though, a very important philosophical difference, and also a difference of view of what the current market is. But the FCC is an expert agency on the operation of the market. It's not just shooting blanks. It gets things wrong, like every agency does, but it also gets a lot of things right.
So one last question. We've talked about the White House. We've talked about the Congress. Let's talk about the United Nations. A lot of us do follow what's going on with the Internet Governance Forum and WICIT, and both party platforms do talk about the need for private sector leadership. I'm not so interested in the policy position. I'm interested in the different styles of the two administrations. The Romney administration, the Romney campaign, is not a big fan of working with other countries. You have some people in the Republican side of the House that believe the UN has black helicopters. Do you think there'd be a difference in how the United States government interacted with international bodies? Would one side or the other be more effective in making sure we don't see international action by other countries that gets in the way of the open internet around the world?
Do I get to go first by seniority or something? Age?
Well, he's got more frequent flyer miles, so
Yeah.
I'll turn it to John first.
I don't know. I lost my battery. I don't know that, and I would confess to their style. It's quite clear that both platforms and the current administration policy is very firm. They don't want to cede regulatory control of the internet to the United Nations. I worry about what I said at the outset. It's one thing to say we firmly believe that there should not be intergovernmental regulation of this, but you also need to lead by example. And I also want to point out, I think in terms of the Secretary Clinton's work on internet openness and the examples we've seen around the world, the power of this technology to change things. These things are the worst thing that's happened to a dictator in 100 years. And it's going to stay that way, and it's very, very powerful. And I think the administration should be commended for the rhetoric that they brought to it and the example that they brought to it. I think the difference is, like I said, I worry about the unintended consequences and the lack of coordination of policy, where, like I said, particularly on some of the things around cyber and some of the other regulatory environments where what we believe and what we say in the international community is not necessarily what we practice in our own domestic regulations, has the potential to be a self-inflicted wound in this laudable effort that we all equally support.
So, Eddie?
Well, I won't rehash
What I've said previously on this, I don't think that we do talk out of both sides of our mouths. I think we're trying to come up with the irreducible minimum of what's necessary to protect critical infrastructure here at home. At the same time, we've been very, very aggressive speaking about the importance of internet openness abroad. I think we've also engaged the world in other ways with respect to telecom policy. Very important. We've signed international agreements with Mexico and Canada and with the EU. The chairman and I went to Asia to advocate for basically open networks and open markets in the IT space very aggressively. It is an area of tremendous agreement. It's something that I think, I'm just saying this completely off the cuff, but this is something we all need to work on very, very intensely together. Cautiously optimistic about the WICIT, but it's going to take, I think, a unified voice and skilled diplomacy to achieve the goals that the United States has for the internet, which are so crucial to so many countries. It's in everybody's self-interest, not just the United States.
And it happens just between the two,
that's true.
between the election and the inauguration, so it's particularly interesting timing.
I would only add one thought, I think, which is this is a huge area of agreement. Nobody wants to see a UN-run internet, I don't think, at least in this room or this audience. I think it may hinge ultimately less on how well you're working directly diplomatically, bilaterally, or multilaterally with governments, as it will rallying the global private sector in each of those countries to communicate.
Great point. Okay, a clarifying question. What technology were you thinking of 100 years ago? I've heard it said that this is the most powerful technology in 230 years. Since the guillotine, that was the last time we had technology that worked so well.
I'll go with the guillotine.
Okay, go with the guillotine. Okay, so introduce yourself and keep your questions to questions.
Oh, you're gonna close it?
Stand up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Benny Markowski. I'm also with the DC chapter. I can use this.
And the Bulgarian chapter.
And chairing the Bulgarian chapter. But I actually talking about dictatorship. It's just a remark. It's not the phone that changed it. It was the VHS. Because when we started watching movies with James Bond in like the 80s, we realized that the Soviet system is collapsing. But on the serious issue, I've been participating at the ITU meetings since like for the last 12 years, and I have to tell you, it doesn't matter which administration is going to run or who's going to win the elections. It's thanks to the people who are actually working at the NTIA and the DLC and the State Department who are in the field, who managed to sit down, like for example at the ITU planning potential meeting 2 years ago, and reach out an agreement with the Russians, the Chinese, and the Arab world to, for example, recognize for the first time ever that ICANN exists. Like until 2 years ago, the ITU would say ICANN doesn't exist. We don't recognize ICANN, so it doesn't exist. So my thinking is, and my urge rather, is that the elections really are important for the country. But for the development of the internet, it's more important that the people who work at these agencies feel the support no matter who is in charge.
So that's a bouquet to you, John, for recruiting such good people.
No, and look, they weren't. I didn't recruit them. You know, Fiona Alexander predates my tenure. Dick Baird at the State Department predates
Everyone's.
We have the Eisenhower administration. I think he spent more time at the Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva than pretty much anybody in the world. But they are, you know, exemplary civil servants, and you know, we as a country owe all of them a great debt of gratitude. We're lucky to have them.
My friend Larry Irving, who had your job before you, was astonished to discover when he moved into his office that the civil servants all referred to him and all the other political appointees as the temps. And it's important for us to remember it.
That's right. And I think a common denominator to those people you mentioned, and I would add Michelle O'Neill, who's no longer at Commerce, and some others in that space. But the common denominator I would submit is their ability to work with and rally, as I was saying before, many of you in the room and folks in the private sector. So not only working behind kind of the government firewall, but working with folks outside, so when they go to Geneva or wherever it is, they have the trust and support of the private sector. Huge benefit.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Samir. I'm an innovation consultant at the World Bank, and I'm also a student of Professor Nelson at the Georgetown University Communication Technology Program.
But this isn't a requirement for class.
I'm not getting extra credit for this. My question is, I work a lot in the space of open government and open data, which hasn't really been referenced here too much. I'm really curious about the different kind of approach that both parties and candidates might take to this. I know I'm very familiar with what the Obama administration is doing in this space with the White House Innovation Fellows and the Open Government Partnership and their really active role in that. I looked at this document that was handed to us earlier. It outlines all that for the Obama side, and then the Romney side it says he has called for modernizing the Department of the VA by implementing an improved electronic claims processing system, and that's it. So I would love to know more about, from that side, what kind of proactive engagement along the lines of what we've seen with the Obama administration with progress.
Well,
If I can be the nasty talk show host, I'll pile on.
Go ahead.
And ask, would there be a difference in how open and transparent the Romney administration is? The FCC has gotten more requests for documents from the Congress and slow walked several of those requests. Mr. Romney has only given us 1 year of tax records. Are we going to be more open here? In the second term of the administration or in the Romney administration?
Neither John or I speak for the Romney campaign in any way, shape, or form. Michael brought this up on our call we had earlier this afternoon, and I will confess my immediate reaction was, well, what are you talking about? And that's reflecting my own background. I worked for a member of Congress, Jennifer Dunn, who passed a sunshine requirement for the House of Representatives so that we had to have all the hearings, no more closed doors, and votes taken behind closed doors. So, I kind of thought I was on the side of transparency. I would say that there have been some real rock stars in the administration on that point. And open data and the great work that Vivek did on Cloud First and some other things, some great things. I personally kind of view this as a bit of a one-way street. It's not like we're going to go backwards on any of these things. I really have trouble seeing that happen.
I'm a cyber optimist.
Yep.
Okay, next question. All the way in the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great discussion. Let me go from the general,
please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Bill Cunningham, and I work for minorityfinance.com. Let me go from the very general to the specific. Crowdfunding and the Jobs Act, which seem to be a pretty good bipartisan effort to use the internet as it was intended, which, and for those of you who don't know, crowdfunding is raising equity capital over the internet. So if there's a change at the top, what happens to crowdfunding and the Jobs Act and, that effort? Oh, I should also warn you that I'm writing a book on crowdfunding. Okay, so this might show up.
Any thoughts on this one?
Well, I don't know. Again, don't speak for the campaign in any way, shape, or form, but I do think that Republicans are a little bit more comfortable with trying more dramatic experiments that are more private sector based. And I hesitate when I say that because this administration has things they can point to, absolutely, positively. But I also think that the Republican philosophy of smaller government is better government, private sector's more efficient model, that they would be more open to some of those things.
And we do know that the people who made money from crowdfunding, the people who made the investments would pay less on capital gains tax. Most likely.
Tax policy matters.
But this is a good example of why the FCC wanted to have open internet rules. The whole point of open internet rules is to allow small entrepreneurs with a good idea, with a new concept, to be able to get on to the internet and run their businesses without having necessarily to face the potential of paying a toll or having their traffic handled differently than the traffic of larger competitors or people who have affiliations with ISPs or whatever it might be. That's the basic concept behind this, and that's why, candidly, I think you've seen such a flourishing of the app economy. We've had open internet either principles or rules in place for 6 years now, with both Republican and Democratic administrations, and the result is an app economy that has added 455,000 jobs in the last couple of years, and an overall internet economy that's added over 1.5 million. That's what we were thinking about. The companies and the ideas that weren't hatched 3 years ago now have been hatched, and we'll see where they go. They'll rise or fall on their own merits.
Very good. Okay, back to a real microphone here. David?
Two brief questions. The first one, I'm going to take us back to the general from the specific. While you guys can't comment really on how a Romney administration would be in terms of open government, how would you compare the Obama administration to the Bush administration? And the second question is, somebody brought up internet sales tax. I think that would be a great subject to hear the differences on.
I don't see an enormous, particularly at the sort of level that we all have worked in the nuts and bolts of the operation of executive branch agencies or independent agencies. Independent agencies are governed by the Administrative Procedures Act that has very clear rules on how you communicate into the regulator, when that's published, how that comes out. We were bound by similar rules and standards when I was in the executive branch. I probably testified 15 times before the Congress in open forums to have questions. We had Anytime there was a Freedom of Information Act request, the same rules applied to us as applied to the Obama administration. So I think, we'll echo a bit what Phil was saying about that. These are, it's a path of progress that we sort of move along administration by administration. I think it's somewhat over-dramatized sometimes, the idea that some are more opaque than others. When failures arise, that's what we have, inspector generals for, and I think everybody who comes into this, maybe the Nixon administration being the exception, they're trying to be public servants, and I don't think there's a lot of incentive or much motivation to be anything other than transparent. Transparency is the best way to communicate your opinions, and the best way to get support for your opinions is to get them out to the American public and have a debate on this stuff. If you've got an incentive to hide things and you're not working in national security and classified areas, it's a pretty good indication that you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
I do think there are some differences, although I think philosophically it may not be huge. I can only speak to what we did, which is we put a ton more online. We live streamed a tremendous amount of stuff. We got our data out there. So there's no way of knowing what the Republicans would have done if they'd been there as the technology developed. And so I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just saying there is a track record that we can point to of changes in the ex parte rules. A whole series of openness things. But I think transparency has a different element that's very, very important, which is the use of transparency either to drive competition through, for example, the publication of broadband speeds. Are they delivering what they advertise? Very important. We innovated in that area considerably. Things like political contributions. This was resisted by some of the Republicans. We're forcing the broadcasters to put online the information in a searchable way that for the political advertising buys. We think that's a good thing. That helps the system. So there are some differences, not huge ones, but we have a track record we're very proud of.
Okay.
I would just echo that. I think the technology's moved along, information moves faster and more freely, more things are possible. Credit to the Obama administration for thinking of some of those things that were now possible or more cost-effective than to do as prices have come down. And so, but I do think it's a bit of a one-way street, and I think it can sometimes be taken too far. My good friend Anna Eshoo is a great champion for something which I think is a horrible idea, which is to say to procurement officers, you really ought to look at the political contributions of contractors before you make a contract decision. I do not believe we need to bring politics into procurement. So I think transparency can sometimes be taken to an extent that is actually not helpful to the process.
Okay, question back here. And remember, state your name, please.
Hi, I'm Andrew Bridges from San Francisco. So Homeland Security has been seizing domain names, .com and .cc domains, including of foreign domain owners, and has been prosecuting an English university student for his activities with respect to a .com and a .cc domain. And we saw the commando-style raid on kin.com in New Zealand. Do you think this type of enforcement is going to affect some of the attitudes of the Internet Governance Forum regarding who controls the Internet? And second part of the question is, do you believe that Romney administration would deploy the forces of Homeland Security differently from the Obama administration with respect to intellectual property?
Two very hard questions.
I will plead relative ignorance on these issues. I don't know enough to comment about them. I will take one thread of what you said, though, and underscore how important I think that is. The Internet, is this fantastic global medium, is incredibly fragile and beset on all sides right now. So there's the ITU that maybe wants to run things. There are the BRIC countries who have a different view of governance. There is real concern about a U.S. attitude of being our Internet. And for policymakers, especially on Capitol Hill, they need to hold this thing gently, and not go overboard on saying this is our internet and we're going to tell ICANN what they can do. You need to tread softly there, because these global attitudes, other attitudes in other countries, really are going to matter, and we could end up falling off the edge into something that is a government-run organization, which would be, I think, bad for everybody. Or we could balkanize it into different pieces because of cybersecurity concerns. So that I just wanted to pick at that one thread because it's the only one I'm really able to comment
on. This is something that Ed and I talked about a little bit earlier. Even though I will, here's where I get to say consistency is the hobgoblin of a little mind. I cautioned against us taking too much of a heavy regulatory approach, as that being a way that would feed into the people who want more of an international standard. But there are basic rules of law that we have to deal with on the internet. There are broad areas of international consensus around protection of children online and financial fraud and a whole host of other kinds of malfeasance that the internet enables. One of the things you get to is intellectual property. And one of the challenges around the internet is the inherently global nature of it, the ability of a malactor to place themselves far from the reach of law enforcement and engage in any range of illegal or otherwise antisocial behavior. It can go from something as commercially important but seemingly insignificant as downloading of illegal music files to really sophisticated cyber attacks. So this is a challenge that we have, to bring some level of rule of law to the internet so it does not simply become a wild west that in the service of an open internet, we've given up really important and serious national security and law enforcement concerns. But you need to try and do it in a way where it is transparent, where the rules of the road are known, and where the standard sorts of constraints on government power are imposed. That there should be a legal finding from some relevant court of jurisdiction that says this site is engaged in exclusively illegal activity. They've been warned. We're going to take it down, and we've got the ability to take it down because there is a geographic nexus in the United States where it comes from, in some way, shape, or form. Building that consensus in a way that doesn't, as Phil points out, alienate our international partners and like-minded administrations, that allows for the vibrant, free exchange of information and ideas that the internet represents, and do it in a way that doesn't create too much authority for regulators in the government. That's the easy problem we're struggling with, right? So I don't know in particular what the policy change would be. I think whatever administration is in place in January is going to have a very difficult time in dealing with that. We've dealt with it more or less as the internet has grown and expanded over the past 25 years, but it's a part of that's not.
Ed, do you have the answer to the problem?
I think that John just gave an extraordinarily eloquent articulation of how difficult the balancing act is, and as Phil mentioned, the stakes are very high because the global internet is under assault, and preserving it and expanding it and nurturing it is crucially important. And John has just very, very nicely articulated how difficult it is to get it just right.
I think there's not only bipartisan support. I think every person in the room wholeheartedly agrees, and that's why we're here.
David had part of the question we didn't get.
Oh, okay. David's question about transparency. Oh, internet taxation, yes.
I want to go there.
If I let you, I yield you 2 minutes. We have enough time for two very short questions.
I need to disclose in total transparency that I am also executive director of New Coalition to Oppose, making web retailers internet tax collectors. But I think the internet community ought to think about a couple of things there. One, there's frustration that taxes aren't being paid at the end of the line, which is because of a couple of provisions in the Constitution has been left to the individuals at the end of that chain to take care of. There's frustration about that. So the solution proposed is to go to an intermediary, a web retailer. I think when you start going up the chain to intermediaries in the internet space, we all ought to stop and think about that. I also think because it's a global medium, we ought to think about the fact that we would be in a very awkward position to tell the WTO, for instance, that we shouldn't start collecting tax for foreign governments, tax collectors, in this space. Once we have established the idea that, yeah, you can have intermediaries collect for you across state lines, and why not international? So I think those are higher level things that the internet community should think about in this particular debate.
So two really thorny policy problems in 2 minutes. That's pretty good. Okay, I think we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Young. I'm a former student of Professor Nelson's, and I'm here from Electronic Media and Politics. One of the motifs, maybe not major themes that I've heard throughout tonight, is the difficulty in getting different agencies and communities that work on internet policy together to work on major issues. But when they do, we see better results. I think it was you who mentioned this. So how would the Romney Administration deal with bringing these different groups together to talk about policy issues? And B, how can we build a better system that gets these different groups talking to have better policy in the future? Thank you.
The third really hard problem in 3 minutes.
Well, what hasn't been announced yet is that John Muir is going to be the internet czar.
Huzzah.
No, I think we talked. Everybody in the audience.
It's already been tweeted. It's already official.
Tongue firmly planted in cheek. Well, this is the business of government, and folks who, especially the civil servants we talked about before, who commit their entire professional life to that. This is hard work to do the necessary interagency coordination, and then, like a multi-level chess game, you have to then take that through the prism of the Hill, as well as international because of the global media. So this is terrifically hard work. I don't think there's a big bipartisan difference on the notion or the general approach that we have to coordinate these and find these. The differences are going to be either more subtle in the execution of that or more fundamental in the philosophical approach that you bring to the table, and whether you're trying to shape the market or work with the market, if you're trying to lead the market or follow. These are subtleties that I tried to, there was no mistake in the opening when I talked about how, one says it's a social and economic force, and the other says, yes, it is an economic and social force. Those are just very subtle philosophical differences that then get expressed in the way you execute government.
Okay, I think we're going to turn to our last questioner, and then we'll have time for some refreshments.
Jim Myron, technology writer. The panelists have spoken about the importance of mobile technology in the U.S. right now and the further development of that. One obstacle on that goal right now appears to be the patent law. From your host at Google have had some setbacks very recently with the Android platform. What recommendations would you have for the next administration of either party of ways to improve the intellectual property field for the technology industry? Thank you.
I think that's probably Phil, since you were in the Department of Commerce and got to deal with both NTIA and PTO.
I'm going to answer in part by going back to a little bit of history when we got patent reform through the House a couple of years ago. The fact that it was narrow, in my humble opinion, there will be folks who differ certainly, but the fact that it was so narrow was a powerful signal that this community writ large, the innovation community, has not gotten its act together well enough to to express itself in the public square. So things that I think, again, people will disagree, that I think should have been on the suspension calendar because they had more than 2/3 majority, end up being nail-biter votes. And this is, I think, a bit of an indictment of the industry not being able to get its own message and act together well enough. I think it's a maturing, still very young industry and medium, and that is only going to get better, whether it's through multiple coalitions or associations or whatever the case may be. But I think we still, as an industry, run very thin when it comes to the public square and have more difficulty than we should winning major policy. That was.
But we can't mobilize the netizens.
And
when
obviously,
SOPA was on the floor,
was a great example. I was in visiting the Senate office at the height of those calls, and it was fascinating to watch the overwhelming, how the staff was all hands on deck trying to deal with all the phone calls and everything else. It really was an overwhelming, interesting, and probably seminal moment for the internet.
But SOPA was a lot easier to explain than that.
But also an example of how in today's Washington it's easier to stop something than it is to get something through, and that's difficult. But I wouldn't want to end on a note of pessimism, because just to follow up on this last question, I don't know what the exact statistic is, but I think it's something close to this, that in 2009 something like 20% of these cell phone mobile devices in the world operated with a US-based OS software in it. I believe that number is close to 70% today.
And Nokia is not happy about it.
Right, but this is a testament to the vibrancy of the private sector, of the incredible bright spot that this particular ecosystem is in an American economy that in other ways is still struggling. And we should be very, very happy about that. And I think all three of us up here are techno evangelists, that these kinds of innovations, the investments in these networks, are part of what are going to drive a very bright American future.
So close here and give each of you an opportunity to give us one more reason for optimism.
Well, I think when you step back and look at the big picture, some of the problems we wrestle with are the result of growth and maturity and growing importance in the global economy. And so while there are no shortages of challenges to look at, when you step back and look at, as was just referred to, you look at some of the big pictures and the trends. Reality is going to be on our side, and as my boss Don Evans used to say at Commerce, the trend is our friend. And we need to not forget that as we go forward, and as we go forward in multilateral settings, that we are on the side of innovation, on the side of openness and democracy, and things that I think are still wildly popular around the globe. We need to find ways to come together around those.
Basically the same. We have such massive structural built-in comparative advantages in our economy, driven in no small part by the innovation that these industries represent. And it's not just the power of these industries, it's the productivity gains they bring and spread across the entire economy, creating and destroying entirely new businesses and industries in what seems like a blink of an eye. It really is remarkable. I was with some friends and we were talking about industries and brand names and companies that came from zero to ubiquity to zero again as technology does its creative, destructive bit, tearing through the economy. And it is disruptive, and when you're on the wrong end of it, it is terrifying and scary, but it moves in exactly one direction, which is forward, bringing quality of life gains to people across the planet, and we're going to keep riding that wave.
And if I can close with three very short reasons for optimism. The first is I'm optimistic because we can have such a civilized, intelligent discussion on such a very important set of digital issues. And I want to thank you for doing that. The second reason, I think, is the technology is moving so fast that Congress can't possibly catch up. And the last reason I'm very optimistic is we have such a good audience here, so many talented people who are committed to learning more about the internet and how they can make sure it stays open and free. So join me in thanking our panelists, and please stay around.